as a matter of metaphysical reality, we live in a deterministic universe.
Free will is free will for a purpose. You're doing something because it means something, not just because it's a random choice.
What are we ever trying to do but trying to get what's true? We wouldn't want to be free, not free to go whichever way we want. We want to go to the truth.
The second thing is that people overestimate the extent to which a free choice has to be a conscious choice. So these psychologists...
You do what you do because of the way you are in any given situation. Okay, so to be ultimately responsible for what you do, you have to be ultimately responsible for how you are. Premise 2. Premise 3, well, but you can't be ultimately responsible for the way you are because you'd have to be there already to kind of set yourself up, and that would lead to an infinite regress. So you can't be ultimately responsible for what you do. That's the argument.
And why doesn't it have an impact on how we run things in society, how we might run our criminal justice system, say?
Good, yeah. I think there are three answers I want to give. One is my dad's answer, a famous paper called Freedom and Resentment by P.F. Strawson, where he says, it's just not a real question for us because we're emotionally tuned in such a way that we can't not treat other people as free and feel guilty ourselves. My answer is different because I think he thinks the true ground of the inability to give up belief in free will is our attitudes to others. I think it's our own experience of free will. And this on the societal matter, I think I had a pupil called Saul Smilansky, and I think he gives a good answer, which is really it's a necessary illusion in a way, for some simple reasons and some very complicated reasons, which we could go into. I mean, one of the things is we can't help believing we are free, and it would be a tremendous affront to our self-image and our self-conception if we were treated as if we hadn't got it. I better perhaps now also give you the little toy story about why we can't help believing it, okay? I'm afraid I've not been very imaginative. I've had a story I tell for ages, but I'm going to tell it again. So, it's the evening of a national holiday. You've got, it's a feast, you've got a spread, but you think really nice to have one more cake on the table when everyone comes tomorrow. So you go to the shop and you've got £10 and the shop's about to close and there's one cake left in the shop and it costs £10. And on the step of the shop is a person collecting money for Oxfam, for a charity. And you stand there and existentially, pragmatically, you cannot not feel yourself to be absolutely, radically free to choose which thing to do. Even if you believe determinism is true and that 5 minutes later you can turn back around and say, well, what I did was determined, in that moment you are radically, existentially free. That's my argument. That's why I think it's primarily grounded in first-person experience, not in social matters.
Seems to me that the question, are human beings free or not, is the wrong question and a dangerous question, because if we ask ourselves about the ways in which human beings, all human beings, are caught in a deterministic universe, inevitably, that focuses our attention away from the really crucial ways in which some human beings are more free than others. So philosophers have long thought that just as a matter of metaphysical reality, we live in a deterministic universe. Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century, David Hume in the 18th century thought that every action that human beings perform comes about as a result of a chain of cause and effect. That's just the world, that's the metaphysical reality about the world that we live in. When I am confronted with a choice between a stick of celery and a piece of chocolate, however much I think I might have wanted to choose the celery, in the end I choose the chocolate. I think as I'm going out for an evening that I'm not going to drink. And then someone hands me a glass of wine, I think, all right. And there's this way in which my actions are determined. you know, another sort of deeper kind of psychoanalytic way of thinking about it would be that I used to think a lot about freedom and the way in which I was making choices, but it just turns out, as a matter of fact, that I've ended up doing broadly the same job as my mother. So there's a kind of, so there's this deterministic metaphysical reality. But what David Hume pointed out is that, sure, the universe is governed by determinism. But that has no bearing on our phenomenological experience of the world, which is that of freedom. We feel as though we are free. We experience freedom. And it's that lived reality which I think we need to concentrate on, partly because, as Paul has suggested, without the belief in freedom, we lose all sense of responsibility. So if it's not the case that I'm free not to murder, if I'm not free not to lie, then it would make no sense to blame me for doing those things. And the entirety of society becomes unintelligible unless we take it for granted that there is such a thing as freedom and the responsibility that goes alongside that. And secondly, the reason why I think we have to think about the freedom as it is experienced is because we all know the difference between a life that feels free and a life that is impeded in various ways. We are sitting here in Hampstead free to talk about freedom when there are people in this country who are locked in rooms being forced to have sex. There is a very distinct, there are many crucial distinctions between the experience of freedom and different people's lives. And it's that sharp end, if you like, of the lived experience of freedom or unfreedom that we need to take account of. A woman is unfree if she does not have access to legal, safe, free abortion. And of course there, the ambiguity of the word free is very instructive because it indicates the ways in which our freedom as human beings is deeply dependent on our economic circumstances. So there are very basic ways in which money gives you freedom. In some countries, if you don't actually have money, you don't have the freedom to live because you can't afford healthcare. So I think that we have to take account, screw the metaphysics and let's focus on our lived reality, which is that we know the difference between a free and a less free life. And it's our responsibility as free agents to try to give people as much control over their lives as possible.
Well, I've always been troubled by free will, one or the other. And there are experiments people do which show that some part of you try to make a conscious choice about something, and there's some evidence of a build-up of signals which tells you that some part of the brain knew which choice you were going to make. But all these things are not what you'd use free will for, you see. It's not quite... Particularly because I had experiences when I was young, you see. Let me give you this. My younger brother there's this game, scissors and paper, stone, you know that way. And there are three things you do, either the scissors or the paper or the stone, and you don't reveal it until the last minute. And he used to wallop me at this game consistently. And I thought I was using free will, you see, to decide which I'm going to do. How does he know? Is it some mystery predicting the future or something? So what I did is I went to a table of logarithms, and I just worked it out, 7 means stone, 8 means scissors, or whatever it was, and it's all the way through, you see. So I take these digits, and I would play this game reading off the digits, and then I broke even. So it was as though my free will was not really much of a free will, you see. I was just doing what sort of came easily to me at the moment. And that kind of thing, okay, maybe you can make predictions about what people are going to guess next. And it's not really free will is free will for a purpose. You're doing something because it means something, not just because it's a random choice. But I don't know, I've always been in two minds about that. And you see physics, you might think, well, it's all determined, and so what you do now is determined by what happened yesterday, if you knew all the details of how all particles were moving. But this isn't quite true as things go, because you have this curious thing that in quantum mechanics you have the collapse of the wave function, that the Schrödinger equation chugs along and says what's going to happen. Suddenly it doesn't. It's something, it jumps to this or that. And people usually talk about this in terms of measurements. But my view is that it's happening all the time, and you have just lots of particles, and when they get up to a certain mass level, then it does one thing or another. And whenever those choices are made, you see, Stuart Hameroff and I have built up this idea about consciousness, and we consider that consciousness comes about when these collapse wave function things happen. Now the question is, does it collapse in a way which is random? That's the way physics works now. You consider it to be quite random. Or if it's maybe entangled with all sorts of other things, and that the decision about what it makes, this or that, has some kind of content to it, some mental content which is not altogether random. And that would be where the free will plays its role. So, you know, maybe that's controlled by some deterministic laws which go deeper than the laws we know now. Or is there some actual freedom in what happens in the operation of the universe? I'm not making any sitting on one side or the other here. It just seems to me quite appealing that there is something in a choice which is not actually determined by the other laws of physics, and it's something much more subtle than being random. It would have to be something which has goes beyond computation, and that's what I claim is involved when we make conscious choices. But whether it's how free it is, I don't know. I wouldn't like to make a strong claim on that. But there's room for some kind of a thing that you might call free will there, yes.
That I'm what philosophers call an incompatibilist. That's to say, I am someone who thinks that free will is incompatible with determinism, the thesis that philosophers call determinism. That's to say, the idea that everything that happens is determined by prior causes. So I do have a different position from both Dan and Patrick. I think Dan is a compatibilist, for example. Where I share their view is in thinking that free will, even on an incompatibilist conception of it, such as I have, doesn't have to be mysterious or in conflict with science or anything like that. I mean, the way I think about the power of free will, which I actually give a different name to, I call it agency, because I think the term free will tends to suggest that free will has to be a rather highfalutin thing, which could not be had by simpler agents such as animals. Whereas the perspective I want to bring to the free will debate is to say, well, look, mightn't it be that our nature as animals is what, as it were, provides the core resources that we need in order to have indeterministic free will? That's what I believe is the case, that animals are really rather special creatures with special biological powers, not mysterious powers. They're powers that we can come to understand, and they do indeed derive from aspects of our materiality. Of course, they don't come from nowhere. They're not God-given. We don't have to buy any of this in order to think that incompatibilism might be true, and that the world is not deterministic, in part because of the existence of creatures like animals, which do have the capacity, as I put it, to settle things. That's to say, to make the world go one way when it really could have gone another, not just could have gone another in some, relative way. So that I do think I disagree, both certainly with Dan, and probably also with Patrick, in thinking that indeterminism is a necessary condition for free will. But I don't worry about that, because I think the world is indeterministic, and there's no doubt at all that it is.
kind of free will that the law and that our everyday folk understanding of morality presupposes is a compatibilist notion. We do say it could have done otherwise, but what we mean by that is not something metaphysical, but something very practical. We don't hold very small children morally responsible because in an important sense, they couldn't have done otherwise about things that they will soon be able to do otherwise, because they will have acquired the capacity to reflect and anticipate and assess the likely effects of their actions, and will choose if they're well raised and are have a good heart and are solid citizens, they'll choose a course which doesn't cause great harm because they can. Now this is the could have done otherwise of control theory. Has nothing to do with quantum indeterminism. If you take one of my favorite examples, take two chess-playing computers. They're both, let's say, entirely deterministic, but they make use of pseudo-random numbers. And if you put two chess-playing computers to playing chess against each other, thousands of games, like DeepMind's Go program. One program will win most of the time, maybe all the time. Why did it win? Because it makes better choices. You have to go to that higher level to see. It's not something in the fine-grained molecular structure of the programs. They could be identical. They could be running on the same hardware. It's the fact that one of them makes wiser choices because it makes better use of information. Now, children growing up grow into free will. They don't have morally relevant free will when they're born. Free will is something you grow into. And as Helen says, forget about magical moments when you Shazam, you suddenly have free will. It's something that we grow into. It's a competence. It's a set of competences that gradually accrue. And we have sometimes special ceremonies where we say, you're now an adult. You now have the rights and responsibilities of a responsible adult. And most people make the grade. And there's nothing magical, there's nothing even metaphysical about it. Determinism is simply irrelevant to the question of whether or not that process occurs. It obviously does occur in this world. And that's why when some people writing about free will, they're always trotting out cases of people with brain tumors who go killing people or something like that. Well, yes, of course, those people don't have free will because they don't have the competences, because they have an explicable defect. They can't do otherwise because they're not wired right for doing otherwise. But that doesn't mean you can't be wired right. Most people are wired right.
If the universe is not predetermined, we live in a determined universe with cause and effect, but not predetermined, then the outcome is not predictable, not even in principle. Not even Laplace's demon that knows every particle and every motion and so forth can predict.
Well, what does that mean? Can you just clarify what you mean? Again, in principle, there's a quantum mechanical calculation that won't predict what will happen, but will predict the probability of what will happen. And then, as Sabina mentioned, there is this issue of the quantum measurement problem that is unresolved. I agree with what Sabina said completely. That's the missing piece. But if we put that to the side just for having this conversation, I would say that the probabilities are in principle determined by the collection of particles that are engaged in whatever macroscopic system you're talking about.
Interesting. Yeah. So this kind of touches on almost the free will determinism problem.
Oh,
see here again,
a big impact from free will.
Yeah.
It doesn't exist.
So if you just take like an opioid addiction, you could drill down to the molecular level of synaptic transmissions of neurochemical transmitter substances and how they're affected by cocaine or whatever. And then from there scale up. But at some point, it seems to me the system is so complex, and the person himself or herself is an active agent within the causal net of the universe. And at some point, just decides I'm going to go left instead of right. I'm going to control my addiction, or I'm not. And we know some people can do this and some can't. So it's not that it's determined in the future that we already know exactly, if we knew every particle, which every person that would be an addict and which are not, that in fact there's an element of volition in there, of knowing what the causal vectors are and what you can do to control the forthcoming, your future self, and kind of predetermining your own future self by taking some control over those variables. Here it's a kind of a semantic game maybe, but that's what you mean by volition.
I don't think it's semantic, but I just wouldn't confuse predictability in the sense of being able to do the calculation with some kind of volition, which to me is a ghost in the machine. If it's not the particles and laws of physics, if you're saying there's something else, you got to tell me what that something else is. And I know you well enough to know that you don't think there's anything else.
No, of course not. No.
I think the part of the problem is that when people say there's this scientific determinism, it means everything's cause and effect. There are certain conclusions people draw from that which simply don't follow. One is that therefore there's no such thing as choice. Well, okay, that's not true. People make choices. The question is, what's governing those choices? If you go to the coffee shop now, you will choose one thing or another. So the question is simply what's underlying that. And I think the other problem, which is really important, is that there are different sort of levels of organization of matter. And it's kind of like ridiculous to think that if we accept a deterministic universe, then it means that it only ever makes sense to talk about cause and effect at like the subatomic level. That's not true. Now, and actually not even a lot of the people who deny free will say that. People say, oh, it's going on in your brain. Your brain is not fundamental physics. It's an organization of matter at a higher level of organization. Now, it seems to me that the reason we can have this sort of compatibilism is that the fact that the universe is a causally deterministic.
I think you best tell people what compatibilism is.
Okay, so this is the view that we can accept the fact, good question, good point. We can accept the fact that everything that happens is a result of laws of cause and effect. But the point is that it doesn't mean that the only genuine explanations of what happened are to do with what happens at the most fundamental level of physics. If you smash a car into a wall, the smashing of the car into a wall will cause both things to destruct. That is true and in no way contradicts what we know about science. We're simply describing it at a certain level. And in the same kind of way, I make choices, I make decisions, I have regrets, etc., etc. None of these things are just inherently incompatible with a deterministic universe. And once you see that, then the questions about what problems there are from free will become much, much more subtle and more interesting than we have to either accept the deterministic view or give up on freedom. It does seem to be that frustrating. Once you've explained it all, it seems some people are satisfied that what I say is free will is good enough for free will. Others don't. It's very difficult, actually. There seems to be no. What's difficult is no one. What is funny is what makes people settle. It's difficult. What makes people settle on one side or another seems to be not quite determined by the arguments. There seems to be almost something temperamental about it. Some people are temperamentally inclined to go one way or the other.
For more debates, talks and interviews, subscribe today to the Institute of Art and Ideas at IAI TV.